Alright everybody, I'd like to show you how I diagnosed an engine misfire on my 2002 F350. It's got a Triton V10. A lot of what I'm going to share though is really covering a lot of vehicles, what they go through on an engine misfire. So what's an engine misfire? When I was getting on the gas, press on the gas pedal, and the power would come up, I'd be going faster, the car would kind of stumble and I could have a hesitation. It wasn't a smooth increase on the power curve. When I pressed down on the gas further, it would act like it wouldn't go faster. It kind of started to slow down or stumble, as I use the term. So a lot of times what you can do are some basic troubleshooting things. The first thing I always look at or think about is, what's the gas filter? Is it relatively new, or is it like 3, 4, 5 years old? Because a lot of times the engine misfire will be a fuel deprivation problem. It's getting starved of fuel. So I want to kind of check that off my list. If I've got a bad fuel filter, an old fuel filter, it's really easy to change that. And I always try to keep those every few years switched out. The other thing I want to do though is then to take a look to see if I've got any trouble codes that are flashing. And what I'll do there is use an ODBII connector tester, and that's what I've got here. So all I'll do is it's a basic tool. I've got a link to it at the bottom on the page here below, the descriptors. I'm just plugging this in, turn on the key, and it's going to show me if I've got any trouble codes. That's the next thing I do after I check, make sure my gas filter, fuel filter is good to go. So I'm getting ready to power up the diagnostic tool here, and this is a real basic tool, but it gives you what you need as far as trouble codes. And the codes will come up, and you'll see them on the gauge there on the display. But what I've got going on here are no trouble codes, and that's kind of the double whammy there. There were no trouble codes that were coming up on my display on my scan tool. So that makes things a little more difficult unless you know some things to then proceed to check out. But you always want to start by looking at your trouble codes. But if you don't have any trouble codes, then where do you start? So you're also looking on your dash to see if you've got any dash lights, warning lights that are on. That's going to give you some good information. But what if you don't have any of those? Well, I then go to focus on the ignition system underneath the hood. And what am I dealing with here? Typically my main thing I look at are my coil packs, and those are what are attached to each spark plug. This is what a coil pack looks like from my 2002 F350. All modern cars have coil packs. I replace the ignition coil in older cars, and they're not too awful difficult to replace. You've got to move some things out of the way to get to them. But again, what I'm starting to look at now is to narrow down the potential problems on a typical engine misfire. So if my coil packs are 3, 4, 5 years old, when I got this truck, I first took it to a guy who was having the miss was a terrible miss, and I had never really diagnosed anything like this. He said, yeah, one of your coil packs are bad. He replaced the one for me. It was like $80 for the part, $150 for labor, $250 when it was all said and done for one. I've got a Triton V10, so I had 9 more. A month later, it started missing, doing the same thing. So I thought to myself, well, I think I can go ahead and replace these. So each one of the plugs there pointing to has a coil pack on it. It's not too difficult. There's a stud right there, a bolt that you unscrew, and then you can pull out and you disconnect the electrical connector there to each one of the coil packs, and then put a little silicone grease and then stick the new coil pack onto the new spark plug. I'd always replace the spark plugs too if you're going to the work to replace a coil pack. And then just go one at a time after all of the spark plugs as you pull them out. put a new coil pack on. One thing you might wind up doing is when you're disconnecting the electrical connection, you might break one of the connectors that holds it in. That's what I did, and I had to just zip tie it. I did a zip tie to secure the electrical plug back onto the electrical connector of the coil pack. When you've got older vehicles, these are things that are just going to happen. So just do workarounds. You don't want it to wiggle loose when you're on the road with all the vibration, etc. And then just replicate on the other side. The other thing you want to take off are these engine air breathers. I took off this clamp right here too, just to give me more room to get into the back side of the truck. Same thing with the smaller sports cars, BMWs, Mitsubishis. They're going to really be cramped in there, so you want to take off as much cowling as you can. But this is what you're looking at with a coil pack, one of them, and not too difficult to replace. You know, just kind of recapping things here. These coil packs are manageable for people to replace on their own, kind of the home mechanic. I had a misfire when I was pressing on the gas. About halfway through the power curve, the vehicle would stumble, feels like it wasn't getting gas, or for those that hadn't experienced it before, the car wouldn't go any faster. It felt like it was shaking a little bit. And so came back home, took a look at the gas filter, had a good gas filter. It's relatively new. Then came up here the front, and the coil packs, all the other coil packs were old. I knew I had one new one on there, and so I just replaced the rest of them. Bought them online. Not difficult to do. I've got a link to the coil packs that I purchased below. They're about $100 for all of them versus $80 for a single one I paid at a repair shop. And you can do it if I can do it. So have a good one.